scriptures from Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 53. I came to throw fire upon the earth, Jesus continued, and I wish it were already alight. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and I'm under a huge pressure until it's happened. Do you suppose I've come to give peace to the earth? No, let me tell you, but rather division. From now on, you see, families will be split down the middle, 3 against 2 in a family of 5, and 2 against 3. Father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law.
Good morning. Don't be depressed by that scripture that Sherry Ann just read to you this morning. It can sound kind of depressing all by itself, but I've entitled the message today, What's the Prince of Peace Doing with a Sword? This is part of an icon. It's a little bit defaced there, so that's not intentional. It's just an ancient icon and showing Jesus with a sword. So in the Luke text, Jesus says, do you think that I have come to bring peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. So in Luke uses the word division. Matthew is a little bit more explicit. Matthew's telling of this, says, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So my question is, it has to do with this. What's the Prince of Peace doing with a sword? If that's who he's called. These texts in both Luke and Matthew 10 have been used, and I've heard them in debates used, claiming that Jesus supports or even promotes violence. So I've heard people try to make the case that this passage gives us a pass to use violence, to use division and the sword. It creates a real problem, though, I think, when you look at it that way, because in other places, Jesus seems very opposed to using violence. So the Gospels, you could say, contain some mixed messages on this subject. And here's 4 of them. If you start in the upper left, the announcement of Jesus' birth, you remember, we sing about this at Christmas, was glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. So the very announcement of the birth of the Messiah was that he would be he would bring peace on the earth. But we just read that Jesus, in his own words, said, I didn't come to bring peace. So that's a little bit of a challenge. And then in the bottom left, we hear Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount say, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. So Jesus' teaching in his Sermon on the Mount, which I don't think was a one-off, I don't think he just said that one time, and Matthew and Luke happened to record it the one time he said it. I think this was what he preached everywhere. When it says he went about preaching the gospel of the kingdom, this is the gospel of the kingdom. This is what he was preaching. So it was his core message. Here he seems to be all about peace, even going the extra mile to keep peace between people that might want to not keep peace with you. And then in the upper right, when Jesus was arrested and Peter swung a sword and cut off the Malchus's ear, the servant of the high priest, Jesus said, put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. These are all familiar passages to you, but then we come to the one from today, and now this slide is one that somebody else used, but it's the one that uses, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. So, and the thing that's more concerning to me about this text, if you remember the whole context, as soon as he says, I came to bring division or a sword, he goes on and says in what context he's talking about. And it's among families. He says, I'll turn a father against his son, and a son against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a mother against a daughter, a mother-in-law, and so forth. So the context of this statement, I didn't come to bring peace, but division, is in the family unit. So that ought to clue us right off that Jesus is talking about something specific here, that he's not giving people a pass. When all else fails, you can use violence. He's not giving us a pass. He's not contradicting himself, in other words, from these other cases where he talks about being peaceful. I don't think he's counseling violence against your own family, is what I can say. I don't think Jesus is promoting domestic abuse in this passage, even though you could read it that way. He says, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, and then he immediately talks about family relationships that will be divided because of him. So this does present a bit of a challenge. So let's back up and ask how was Jewish society structured? Because even in our culture today, we consider the family the core unit of culture. And they did then in Israel. Israel was an agrarian society, though most people were agricultural. That's how they existed, through agriculture. Here's a picture of a vineyard in Israel with a family compound on the hill up behind. So a lot of the family homes might have looked something like this, that had vineyards or orchards and raised various crops. The entire Jewish society and most other ancient Near East societies were structured a lot like ours, with the family unit at the center. So we can conceive of it this way: the family unit being at the center of the broader society, what we'd call a nuclear family today: father, mother, children, but it also might have included some aunts and uncles, some grandparents, some more wealthy families. Their family might have included servants or slaves, orphans or concubines. The family, though, was patriarchal. The father was the ruling authority figure. The Hebrew word for family, bet av, means house of a father. It doesn't mean house of a mother. It doesn't mean family. So the house meant it was the house of a father. And to found a family was to build a house. So when the scripture talks about building a house, it's talking about building a family with a father figure as the patriarch. The father was the head of the family. He owned all its property. It wasn't one of these things like you can jointly own stuff today. Spouses commonly jointly own property. No, in that day, the father owned all the property. He was the authority figure. His word was the last word. It ruled. Although he was supposed to be a benevolent father, a benevolent ruler. Wives were subject to their husbands. Daughters were subject to their mothers. And at the father's death, the wealth of his estate was split among his sons, not among his daughters, but among his sons, with an extra share going to the eldest son. If there were no sons of responsible age at the time of a father's death, the mother would become the head of the house for the period of time until the sons became of age and the property could be passed on to them. Mothers could hold responsibilities, though, like buying and selling. We see some of that even in the Old Testament. So this patriarchal arrangement brought order to the family. Whether you agreed with it or not, it made an orderly family unit, right? Family members knew their place. They knew where they were in the pecking order. They understood that. The sixth commandment was, anybody remember? Honor your father and mother. So from the time that the commandments were given, honor your father and mother plays into this way of thinking, right? That the parents should be respected and honored. Things might not always have been fair, but order was maintained through this patriarchal arrangement. The next unit of society was clans. So a clan was like a residential kinship group, kinship group, like might be a group of families or a broader extended family that had other homes close by, like neighboring families would form clans. They might have been related. They didn't have to be related, though. Often these neighbors would help each other. They'd help each other at harvest time and so forth. So this is similar to the way my parents grew up. My father especially grew up in East Dover, a little. If you drive through East Dover, it's just a slow place in the road. It's not much to it. But at the time my dad grew up, it was a little farming community, and they had a grange hall there and a church there, and these people, even though not all of them were related, some certainly were, they celebrated together. They helped each other at harvest time. They went to grange hall together. They went to church together. And it was a small group of people who lived in a close approximation to each other. So it's not foreign to us to think about that. And then the next unit of the society was the tribe. Now, Israel, we all know, originally consisted of 12 tribes. At the time of Jesus, only two identifiable tribes remained, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. The others had lost their unique identity and had been kind of scattered through the various exiles that the Israelites had gone through and the tribe of Judah had gone through. But the tribal attitudes remained. Tribal attitudes remain today. We have tribal attitudes, right? We have religious tribes, like Christian versus Muslim versus Hindu. We have these, we kind of think tribally that way. There are interreligious tribes, like Protestant versus Catholic versus Orthodox. So we all would call ourselves Christian, but we divide ourselves into different tribes or streams, you might say. There are interreligious tribes. For instance, there are evangelical versus charismatic versus mainline, and so forth, and on and on. We divide ourselves further and further into these tribes. And part of it is we often find our identity as much in the tribe we belong to as the family we belong to. And often you grow up in a family and a tribe, and that carries over into your adult life, and sometimes you remain with that same kind of tribal thinking. Sometimes you break out of that and consider other things. And then finally, the last way that they organized society was, of course, by the nation. This is the way Israel and many other nations of the time were organized, in this family, clan, tribe, nation arrangement. Patriarchal, hierarchical. So we definitely know who's the boss, who's not the boss, who's next in line, who's not next in line. All of those arrangements. Men were in charge, women submitted to men. Women were seen by society as little more than property. Brothers understood their place in the family structure, and if you weren't the eldest brother, you didn't expect to get the double inheritance that your older brother was going to get. Respect for this order was expected in the society and enforced. So you'd be disciplined if you went outside these expectations of society, just like we do that today. We have, when somebody violates the spoken and the unspoken rules of our family or of our clan or of our tribe, there are consequences to all of that. So with this in mind, with this structure of the society that Jesus was speaking to in mind, let's look again at this passage in Luke 12. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And then right here, pay attention. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. So Jesus appears here to be calling for the complete upset and rearrangement of the family structure, which was the center of Jewish society. Because all of these divisions he's talking about would have been completely opposed to the orderly structure, the orderly patriarchal, hierarchical structure of the family unit. You seeing that? To turn a son against a father or a daughter against a mother would have been a violation of the 6th commandment. So Jesus is really predicting here, and I think he's predicting, not promoting. I don't think he's saying this is the way it ought to be necessarily, but he is predicting that there will be divisions in families that would really upset the core unit that all of Israeli society was founded on. To call for division or a sword inside the family could be understood as a call to societal anarchy. Because if the family unit comes undone, everything else is built upon that. The clans, the tribes, the nation, all stems from that family unit. And I think it's important to note in this passage, Jesus is not talking about self-protection. He's not talking about using violence to protect your family from intruders, because every example he uses here is inside the family. He's not talking about protecting yourself. He's saying something about his message and his being here is going to start to cause divisions in the fundamental, foundational unit that society is structured on. The division or the sword he's talking about is clearly within families. It's not external to the family. So is Jesus calling for violence between family members? I don't think so. I don't think he's calling for violence here at all. I think he's warning of what is to come as a result of his death and resurrection. His death and resurrection are going to be so radically earth-shattering that it's going to go right to the core unit of societies and cultures. And it's going to make those core units have to rethink things. The death of the Son of God would bring a revelation that would necessarily cause division. When the light comes on, we talk about that. Bing, you understand something that you didn't understand before. Well, the people that haven't had the light come on, like you've had the light come on, that will provide the potential, at least, for division, for some discord in that place, right? And that's what I think he's talking about here. And this revelation would have to work its way through cultures and across centuries, like leaven, and Jesus refers to it that way, before many people would learn to follow the Prince of Peace. So I think there's a better way to understand what Jesus is saying here than that he's calling for us or giving us a pass to be violent with one another. Certainly he doesn't even address being violent with outsiders. It's all in the context of family, and I think we can all agree he doesn't call for us to be abusing one another inside our families. And I don't think we ought to think that here he's contradicting all the other things that he's said about these things. So, to get us there, let's talk about this big word, differentiation. Differentiation. In Jewish society, and actually in lots of societies, they rely on differentiation, male versus female, Jews versus Samaritans, or Jews versus Gentiles, sinners and righteous, slave and free. Patriarchal, hierarchical cultures are obsessed with pointing out and maintaining differences. We're still doing that today. We find order in our differences. But throughout Jesus' ministry, he went about crossing the lines or blurring the lines between these groups, between male and female, Jews and Samaritans, Jews and Gentiles, sinners, righteous, slaves, all of those things. He kept pushing against those differentiation lines. Remember the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan. She was a woman, 2 strikes. She was multiple times divorced, 3 strikes. So Jesus, the Messiah, in the context of his time and the people of Israel, should have had no business talking nicely to a woman like that. Yet it's the longest conversation recorded in the Gospels, is the time he spends with the woman at the well in Samaria. And he addresses to her what true worship is. He didn't address true worship to his disciples. He addressed it to a multiple divorced Samaritan woman, an outsider. When he fed the Gentiles, when he fed the 4,000, that was in the region of the Decapolis. It was a Gentile region. In that same area, he met the man of the Gadarenes, who was not a Jew, freed him from his demonic oppression. He invited women to follow him, Mary and Martha particularly. They were the first witnesses to his resurrection. So Jesus gave women the same kind of place of prominence as his male disciples. He had no problem crossing the sinner-righteous boundary. He would cross that repeatedly. He was accused of being a friend of sinners, a drunk, because he ate with sinners. That was another one of those purity boundaries, those differentiation lines. He invited both zealots and tax collectors to be in his core group of disciples, 2 groups that were opposed completely politically, like inviting Hillary and Donald Trump supporters all in. Let's have at it, all in the same group. So Richard Rohr would call these divisions dualistic, or this way of thinking about society or structuring society as dualistic, or in modern terms we might say it's binary. It's either this or it's that. And if you're not this, then you're that. But Jesus didn't seem to think that way. He constantly pushed against all of these lines that made culture so ordered, and comfortable. I mean, it does provide a comfortable environment if you know that you're the male, that you're the Jew, that you're the righteous, and you're the free. Then everybody else is female, Samaritan, sinners, and slaves. You know, you kind of feel good about yourself that way. But it doesn't do much for the other side of the binary equation, does it? Richard says, and we've heard him say, that we tend to define ourselves over and against someone else. That's binary thinking. And we see that all through the Gospels. When the Pharisees and the chief priests and the rabbis come and talk with Jesus, they're concerned with topics of differentiation. You know, the woman caught in adultery. What are you going to do with this woman? The law says this. What are you going to do, Jesus? So over and over we have these, they're throwing Jesus these dualistic circumstances, and then he answers them in a non-dualistic way. Okay, let's keep going. So here are 5 examples of Jesus crossing boundaries. The Samaritan woman at the well, eating with sinners, the Good Samaritan story. Remember that was presumably Jewish people, Jewish leaders coming upon a person who'd been beaten, left for dead, not caring for him, and a Samaritan coming along and caring for him. Jesus healing cursed lepers. Lepers and sinners were considered under the curse of God. Jesus crossed that boundary. Picking grain on the Sabbath, and then Jesus. So even in their mind, they differentiated the Sabbath from all the other days. Jesus comes along and says, "No, the Sabbath wasn't made for man. Man was made for the Sabbath." So he knocks that wall down too. Jesus wasn't having this dualistic way of thinking. He consistently ignored these difference barriers, and they were the barriers that society had structured itself on. James Warren, a writer, writes this. He says, human cultures are based upon the distinguishing, separating, dividing, sorting, and ordering of differences. And if you think about it, I think that's right. That's how we establish order and a certain comfort level in our cultures. So whenever Jesus crossed one of these difference barriers, he wasn't just doing something nice for an outsider. Like he just wasn't doing something nice for this leper and healing the leper. He just wasn't doing something nice by entertaining a conversation with the Samaritan woman. All of these things that he did, these are not just nice acts of out of the goodness of his heart. They were foundational, revolutionary acts because they were undermining the differences that the society, beginning with the family, was all structured around and structured upon. He was threatening, every time he did this, he was threatening the very stability of their culture. That's why the leaders always came out and were pushing back on him doing these things, because they sensed that if this Jesus is crossing all of these boundaries, he's dissolving the differences that keep us united as a culture. All cultures, except the kingdom of God, are based on the distinguishing, separating, dividing, sorting, and ordering of differences. We do it here today. René Girard coined a term called non-differentiation. It's kind of a long word, but think about it. Not different. Non-differentiation, to help us understand this. And Warren writes about that too. He writes this: a society's ultimate fear is not difference. On the contrary, the real fear is non-difference or non-differentiation. This seems counterintuitive. Don't people in a society fear the one who appears different from them? A stranger perhaps, or a foreigner? Yes, but not because of difference as such. Everybody with me so far? I'll let you take a picture there, Kirk, before I move. He goes on and says, if we fear those who are different, it is because their difference from us is such that we can find no place for it within our own system of differentiations. Okay, and he goes on, their difference thus threatens to expose the relative and essentially arbitrary nature of the system of differences that we hold sacred, thus undermining the system's authority and credibility, making it vulnerable to collapse. So Warren here is pointing out in the stream of Girardian thought that societies aren't really threatened with differences as long as those differences are the ones that we've defined ourselves. The ones that we as a culture have agreed upon, those differences are fine. That's how we come to understand ourselves. That's how we come to create our own image, our own self-identity, is over against the people that we've differentiated ourselves from. But when somebody from outside our system comes in, and their differences are different than our differences, the things that they divide over are different, that puts up a real threat to us. Because what it potentially does, he says, is it threatens the essentially arbitrary nature of the system of differences that we hold sacred. It reveals to us that our rules and our holiness codes and all of that are not universal, because other societies don't hold to the same differentiation codes, right? So we can talk about these differences in different ways. We can call them differences or difference barriers, the line between in and out. We could call it a holiness code, the code of conduct that we adhere to as opposed to what somebody else might adhere to, purity codes, or legal structures. All of these are the way we define our societies and bring meaning to our cultures. The culture at this time was a thoroughly sacrificial culture. It was based on the idea that God needed to be appeased via sacrifice, and the maintenance of these division barriers were all part of that process. So Jesus' life and his ministry of boundary crossing or barrier breaking wasn't just an annoyance. It sought to undermine what their society was built upon. It's that revolutionary. The survival of Israel was being threatened by this lone Nazarene who incessantly violated boundaries and the holiness codes that Israel was built upon. It's time to understand why they crucified him. There's a lot going on there. And at the center of all of these boundaries and all of these holiness codes lay the family. And this is what Jesus goes to in this passage. He goes to this family unit and says, when you understand me, it's going to cause division in this foundational societal building block called the family. How was it structured then? Patriarchally and hierarchically. And whenever Jesus went about and did these things, he violated the patriarchal code and the hierarchical code, which was how they found peace and how they ordered their societies. When Jesus held women as equal to the men, which he obviously did, some people will push back and say, well, only pick male disciples. Yes, I know he only picked male disciples. I think that was a tip of the hat to the culture he was in. He knew that, yes, this culture is so patriarchal, I'm going to pick male disciples. Yet he had, obviously, women disciples that followed him, that served him just like the male disciples did, that supported him financially. The fact that he gave them the assignment of announcing his resurrection, not the men, and all kinds of other things you've heard me talk about, shows that he really valued women as much more than property, which went right to the heart of this family structure. Paul understood this too when he wrote in Galatians 3:28, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for you, all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Do you understand now how radical that statement is? All of those, Jew, Greek, slave, free, male, female, were ways that they sorted and divided themselves. And it brought order to their society. So it's always scary when somebody's attacking or trying to dissolve the divisions that we find comfort in. And that's what was going on. Do you see how absolutely unsettling Jesus' life and ministry was to the Jews of his time? In order for there to be no longer male and female, all the patriarchal norms and roles of their culture would have to come down. You can expect some people might resist that. Yes, to this day. In order for there to no longer be slave or free, Their entire economic system would have to be reimagined and rebuilt on principles of equality and fairness. This is what we struggled with in the Civil War. This is why the South didn't want to stop having slaves, because their whole economy was built on slave labor. In order for there to be no longer Jew or Greek, a massive holy barrier would have to come down, because they saw the Greeks as impure outsiders. It was a barrier that gave Jews their identity over and against all other people. So look again at Luke 12. Do you think I have come to bring peace? No, I tell you, but division. Now you're seeing why he's saying that? It's not because he's given us a pass to be violent. He's just saying that what I'm bringing will cause you to have to reconsider everything, every way that you've structured your cultures and your societies. And that's going to invariably cause some consternation because the power brokers in those cultures are not going to go quietly. He's not saying that division among families is a good thing and that he's promoting it as a good thing. No. He's saying that the removal of the hierarchical, patriarchal barriers within the family will cause divisions. Or he could have said it's going to be tough to teach old dogs new tricks. Or he could have said there's going to be some conflicts around gender that you haven't had to face before. Some wives are going to turn out to be awesome business managers, but their husbands aren't going to want to turn that part of the vineyard over to them. There's going to be some multi-generational situations that will result in conflict. Like some daughters are going to have some great ideas that will put them in conflict with their mothers. When the patriarch is dethroned, he's probably not going to go quietly. He's not going to like that. When the elder brother doesn't get his extra share of the inheritance, but it goes instead to the youngest daughter, there might be some fireworks. When the mother-in-law, well, I'll leave the mother-in-law to you guys. So did Jesus enjoy just blowing up the culture? I don't think so. I think he had a long game in mind here. When Jesus says he didn't come to bring peace but a sword or division, he wasn't advocating for division or for violence. He just knew that the old ways die hard. He knew that when he unlocked the potential of women and sinners and slaves and Gentiles by destroying the holiness codes and religious barriers that had kept them in their subservient places, there would be some resistance to that. The sword that Jesus brings, then, is nothing less than the reordering of society. Those on the bottom of the ladder will rejoice at this. Those on the top will fight to keep their place, just as it is today. Do you want to hear another angle on this too? It's 11. Okay. That one I've targeted pretty much the family unit and the impacts on the society at the time. Gerard goes on a little farther with this. When he proposes that all human culture is rooted in scapegoating, or we find unity, we create communities over and against other people that we see as different for whatever reason, and we scapegoat those others. He says that societies find peace by scapegoating someone or some group and then unifying around that expulsion. That is what Jesus calls the way the world brings peace. Remember in John 14:27 when he said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives." So he's contrasting the kind of peace he's leaving with us or giving us the potential to practice. I mean, it's there. He's demonstrated it for us. It's up to us to actually put it into practice. So he's left us this example of how to be peacemakers. And it's not the way the world gives peace. Do not let your heart be troubled. Don't let it be afraid. So the peace that Jesus leaves is different. It's attained via forgiveness, not sacrifice. So we don't sacrifice others to bring unity to our group. We forgive others to bring unity to the larger group. Because whenever you sacrifice somebody else, you've lost them. They're outside. You've kicked them out. You've othered them. But when you forgive them, you add them to your group. Everywhere in the gospel, or everywhere the gospel is told, the story of Jesus, especially his the way he lived, his death and his resurrection, whenever that story is told, wherever it is told, it begins to deconstruct the peace of the world. Even if it's told in a secular way. Because the cross is really, sociologically, the point at which societies become aware of their victims as being innocent. That's the story of Jesus on the cross. He was an innocent man that we crucified. Prior to that, most all societies assumed that if you met that kind of a death, you were deserving of it, because they thought of rulers and societies as might makes right. If the ruler decrees it, it must be right, because he's attained this position with the help of the gods or whatever other way he has attained it. He's legitimate in that sense. So victims were considered legitimate and guilty. We see this is how Jesus constantly pushed against that idea in his own culture. When people were sick and he healed them, demon-possessed and he delivered them. When he set people free, this came up against the idea that, these people are in that condition because God caused them to be in that condition. That threw that whole idea up in the air. So the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, when that story is told, it begins to deconstruct the idea that things are as they should be when the powers are firmly in control. People become aware of the unjust suffering of victims in the name of keeping peace since the advent of Jesus. So Gerard sees in this passage in Luke the results of the gospel. The gospel takes away the effectiveness of scapegoating. We still do it, but it's not as effective anymore. It only lasts for a little while and it doesn't work for very long. This causes division because not everybody sees this at the same time. So this revelation of the cross, the revelation of the gospel of Jesus, like mustard seed or like leaven, starts to permeate cultures across generations, across centuries, and some people see it, some people don't. And so over time, it's permeating, but it takes time. It takes a long time for it to have an impact. But the impact it has had is an awareness of victims. So that today in the United States, the only people you can get away with victimizing are people that are perceived to be victimizers. Right? So that if you can point out that guy is victimizing this other group, and you can do that legitimately, but that whole way of thinking wasn't even possible, Gerard says, prior to the gospel. We didn't have that ability to think that way. This is the mustard seed or leaven-like nature of the kingdom of God. It slowly permeates cultures, deconstructing the effectiveness of scapegoating and sacrificing other people. And as that happens, there is often less peace, because we're taking away the scapegoating mechanism, the effectiveness of that. It makes us ask, how do we use differences to structure our society? So we can ask that way. For discussion today, that would be one question. How do we use differences still today to structure our societies? Or how do we use differences to structure our churches? Even church to church or within churches. Or here's another question. In what ways are we threatened by the differences of outsiders? In what ways do outsiders threaten us? I think it's good to become aware of that. If you can be aware of the things that threaten you, then you can start asking why. Why do they threaten us? And then you're on the way to understanding it. How can you see how non-difference or sameness can be unsettling? That calls into question why we make the distinctions we do. And if you can ask why, you're on the way to overcoming binary thinking. All right, I'll leave it there.